Good afternoon, Ethan.
Good afternoon. I'm
How are
really
you?
excited. I'm doing great, and we have we have a guest today, which is excellent.
We
Would you
do.
like to introduce our guest?
I'd love to. So, this is a dear friend of mine, Hudson Parris. Hudson, I met him coming up on a year ago now. We met, I believe, last March or so. And since that time, we have had many conversations about all sorts of incredibly important things. We've talked a lot about religion and Christianity. We've talked about philosophy, art, architecture, technology, huge variety of things. And I'd actually like to give Hudson the opportunity to talk a little bit about what he's working on, some of the things that he enjoys. You can see in his background there that he's got a couple paintings going. So tell us a little bit about yourself, Hudson. Thanks for
Yeah,
joining us, by the way.
for sure.
Thank
Of
you.
course. Thank you very much for having me on. Um, yeah, I am doing a number of paintings at the moment, as you can see in the background. My background is in architecture. Um, I have a master's degree in architecture from Kansas State University. Have practiced in Kansas, the Netherlands, and New York for the last couple of years. Been very interested in architectural history and theory, and art history and theory as well. Um, Recently spending a lot of time producing my own art and seeing where that goes, while also keeping a number of architectural projects going that I'm working on. Um, and yes, I love talking about this kind of stuff, and I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah, Gabe, would you like to introduce the subject matter at hand for today?
Yes, and it is such an honor to get to do so. And I will only do so briefly. So today, we are going to be talking about Kazimir Severinovich Malevich, who was born in 1879, passed away in 1935, and he is a very important figure in art history. And as we'll find out from Hudson, his work also had a singular impact upon the trajectory of architecture. So I will not go too far into these details. I'd like to pass it over to Hudson. Can you tell us a little bit about who this guy was and what was his work? What were he? Because I know that he was the founder of the Russian Suprematist art movement. But I'd like to just hear from you about this. Tell us who this is, man.
Yeah, for sure. Kazimir Malevich is definitely an infamous character in the architecture world because he was operating at a time in the early 1900s. At the same time, a lot of radical architects and artists were a part of movements like the Bauhaus. Um, we were kind of moving out of artists and craftsmen, Art Nouveau-esque, very representative art. We were moving away from that, and a lot of really young architects and artists were basically looking at the world with everything happening, the amount of revolutions and revolutionary ideas happening, and many of them started to produce very radical art, interested specifically in an international style. Much of what we think of traditionally today as modern art, modern architecture, are literally 100-year-old ideas. We call it modern, but it's over 100 years old now. So Malevich was one of these guys. He started out as a cubist painter, actually, Picasso and the Cubists, and then he was kind of, he's very interested in um, doing even less than cubism, even less representation. He was particularly interested in the spiritual aspect to architecture, and yeah, basically was a part of this like really young radical movement that was looking to the future. A lot of people thought that technology at the turn of the 1900s was going to liberate humanity and move us towards a kind of utopian vision that they thought would be realized by like the 40s or the 50s. They were like, okay, the world's still a mess. World War One is just kicking off and stuff like that. But we're pretty sure after this war is done, the Great War, after it's done, everybody will be done with all of this nonsense and will kind of achieve utopia. So they were like, okay, strip away all ornamentation from art and architecture. That's where the traditional idea of like the white cube comes from, or the black square, which Kazimir Malevich painted. Um, he famously did a sculpture called Architecton, which is it's sort of like a white cube with these other white cubes stuck to it, and it's this interesting composition. And I was working on an architecture tower competition about 1 year ago, and that sculpture by Casimir was a reference that we had pinned up on the board. It was one of the main references we were looking at. I've worked at, I think, 3 architecture firms now where Malevich's Architecton sculpture has come up, and we've printed it out and been like, this is a great inspiration. So super old radical ideas that are still relevant today, still influencing architecture today. Um, and I'll stop there so I don't rant too much. But I think that was my experience of Malevich, and I think that's the introduction of this dude coming in, turn of the century, new ideas, new world. How can we bring the world together? It's kind of where I think he starts.
I think it's very
Sure.
interesting that you mentioned that because we, over the past several weeks, have been reading an essay by Malevich, God is Not Cast Down, which I believe you've read as well. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things that seems to be a theme throughout this essay, and I was really previously unfamiliar with Malevich's work, but one of the themes is that he seems to, as you said, like strip away all potential attribution and kind of arrive at this, maybe what he describes as nothingness. But maybe we can get
Mhm.
into that essay. Gabe, did you have any sort of introduction for the God is Not Cast Down essay?
I did, but before we get into it, I did just want to briefly go ahead and share my screen here and show, first of all, I have here a higher definition image. For those of you who are seeing the video, I think you should be able to see this is the black square. And I was wondering, Hudson, can you speak in any more detail about is there something special about the black square in particular?
Yeah. No, definitely. A couple of things that are really interesting about the black square is I don't think the black square should actually ever live by itself in a gallery. And I don't
Mm,
think the black square should ever be viewed. It is the piece de resistance, the one that everyone remembers, the black square, but it was part of a larger exhibition, I believe called the Point 10 exhibition. There's a famous picture of the gallery, the space that it was in, a white box with a plethora of paintings on the left and right walls. This guy right here, the black square, lived in the corner at the very top. It sat in the corner, so it was literally at a 45-degree angle, pressed up into the corner. And what's interesting about that, and then there's all of these paintings everywhere, like 25 paintings on this very small space. So it kind of created a static feel, and all of them are suprematism. So this is the only black square, but there was a red square, there's a black cross, there's a number of other colorful compositions. It created a sort of static noise where every painting is a part of the larger composition. And it's unfortunate that we do not have all of the paintings existing today because when they do the exhibition, they often can only show a portion of the paintings. But the black square in particular, like I said, lives in the corner at the top, which in Russian houses was traditionally where a spiritual statue or spiritual painting would live, a religious iconographic painting, um, Mother, Mary, something like that, Jesus, apostles, etc. Something like that would normally be in that space. So the fact that Casimir specifically takes the black square and puts it up in the corner is giving it's part of a religious and spiritual heritage, and he wants his painting to be a part of that. Um, and then maybe the last thing I'll say is just the painting itself is quite interesting because it's starting to crack here. You can see. I believe this is the original that is in Russia, and it won't leave Russia. They don't want it to leave Russia. But this is the original, and it's starting to crack. And if you are there in person and you see it, there's layers of other colors underneath it. It could even be that he didn't think this was going to be a black square when he started it, that perhaps it was going to be a red square, blue square, etc. And you build up the layers, build up the brush strokes, and we kind of end up with black square, which is an interesting little thing about the physical painting itself. But yeah.
That's excellent. Ethan, have you got any questions pertaining to that?
Yeah, I mean, Hudson, since this is your area of expertise, one of the things that I also noticed about some of Malevich's writings is that he discussed like painterly paintings quite a
Mm,
bit. Was his goal to give this a painterly, um, a painterly attribution, or was his goal to make this like a painterly art piece, or was that is that just a result of the aging? Is that his intention, or was that accidental? Is basically what I'm asking. Do you know?
mm. Tell me a little bit more about what you mean painterly.
Yeah, when I mean painterly, I mean like emphasizing, and again, this is not my area of expertise, but from what I've read, it seems like it's almost emphasizing the actual materials of the paint. So the actual
Mm,
brush strokes, the intentionality of like highlighting brush strokes. That's kind of what I'm indicating. And obviously, there's like this cracking kind of uh, again, I don't know if that's just aging or if that was intentional. I was curious if you had any sort of background on that as well.
yeah. The there's two things on my mind when you say that. Number one being at the time when Kazimir Malevich was doing a lot of this stuff, many critics critiqued him and said, "You're not a very good painter." Um, Supposedly the painting techniques are okay, but maybe not masterful. Um, and so that's an interesting little thing. The cracking very well might be on accident. I think it is just aging and accident. I don't think he purposefully meant to have the cracks in there. But what I do know is that the paintings were not meant to be, the fact that you painted them is very important. The process of doing, because I think there's a specialness to the handcraft, the painterly aspect, the idea of artist as a role, as a profession, as a thing, as a human being, um,
As a
but
calling, perhaps.
as a calling perhaps. But the actual skill with which you do it is maybe not as important as the fact that you're doing it at all. So yeah, maybe on purpose, maybe not on purpose,
In
a little bit of both.
conclusion, oh, don't let me cut you off.
No, that's it.
The last thing that I'm curious about on this particular thread is can you talk a little bit about the Russian suprematism art movement?
Mm,
Is that kind of what it was that you were referring to earlier when you said that he was a group of these this
mm,
group of young up and coming artists who had these radical ideas? Was that Russian suprematism, and why, kind of in continuation of that question, how is Malevich situated as a Russian? I know he was born in
mm,
Ukraine, but he is
yeah.
indeed very much a Russian figure. So can you talk a little bit about these two things?
Mm. Well, I could do my best.
Hmm.
Yes, yes, a part of the Russian suprematist movement, group of people. There's another famous photograph of a bunch of architects sitting in a classroom, and they've all designed towers. They all have these beautiful plaster towers in front of them, but they really just look like sculptures. They look a lot like Architecton did, and they look also very much like many towers you would see designed today in the world, which is very interesting. So I did not encounter this. I think I would have to research a bit more, but I would not be surprised if Malevich was teaching at the time or had students at the time. I think he was a part of the academic system, um, and at least a part of a larger collection of specifically Russian suprematists. When I was speaking earlier about radical young movements, there's these guys in Russia. There is the Bauhaus in Germany that was going on. There is the Vienna secessionists. Um, I think what's interesting about him being Russian is it's a Eastern kind of Orthodox background. And it's interesting you bring it up because I think you're right on the nose. People like the Vienna secessionists, the Bauhaus in Germany, are enough West that I think they are, or at least in between the West and the East, that they're coming a little bit more from the Western ideas and a Western religious background, whereas the Russians are dealing specifically with, yeah, Eastern Orthodox spiritual ideas, um, which come with their own iconography, symbology, and in fact, maybe it is more important to them. Obviously, in the West, religious iconography is huge, but was placed in a place of more prominence around the Reformation when the Catholics were like, oh my God, we need to have like beautiful art so people will come back to Catholicism instead of Protestantism. The Orthodox Church from the beginning, from the Byzantine Empire, Constantine, are like iconography, symbols, images, mosaics, gold, halos. That was their thing. So I think Kazimir is coming from a very long history of religious iconography that I think really, obviously, um, that I think shows up in this essay quite a bit and shows up in suprematism quite a bit.
Thank you so much. Ethan, anything else on this matter before we move on to the essay?
No, I think that this context is very informative to me because I'm not as well studied on Malevich or the
Mm.
Russian supremacist movement. Uh, is it supremacist or suprematist? Supremacist.
Suprematist.
Suprematist.
Mm.
Yeah, the Russian suprematist movement. But it is very interesting to me as he appears to have this revolutionary view, which is so diametrically opposed to, as you stated, the Eastern Orthodox view of beauty, right? I mean,
Mm.
this total deviation from the classical view of beauty. And he's trying to strip away all of this like heraldry that's seen as beautiful and then leaving
Mm.
only only the most bare concept possible. And I think that will become very like it's just very interesting to me as I consider the essay and the conclusions of the essay and the anecdotes throughout the essay. So I think that I'll be referencing probably this introduction throughout the essay because again, I think the history really truly informs
Yeah.
um, his philosophy and thought process throughout this. So I just really enjoyed hearing your perspective on this.
Yeah. It's definitely it's a part of a larger system of dominoes, I think, Kazimir Malevich. And it's so interesting because you can pick any domino in the stack and see how the last domino hit it and how that domino is going to hit the next one. And
Yeah.
it's a game of chicken foot.
Excellent. Okay. Well, now we will move on to speaking about this remarkable essay. And Ethan already mentioned this essay is called God is Not Cast Down. This essay was published in 1920, or rather, it was written in 1920. I've got a little blurb here from the Publication Association Zviano, and they speak a little bit about God is Not Cast Down. Now, I will say the essay in its full title is called God is Not Cast Down: Art, Church, and Factory,
Mm.
which, as we will certainly get into, the subhead contains those terms. But let me just read this real quick, and I'm going to also share my screen and show a couple of interesting corresponding images. Go ahead and get this going here. All right. In 2020, Zviano handed over Kazimir Malevich's book, God is Not Cast Down: Art, Church, and Factory, to the Vitebsk Center of Modern Art. This is the first and so far the only original book by Kazimir Malevich in the museum. The book was written in Vitebsk in 1920, and the artist gave lectures on this topic. Although the posters of the time warned that this was unpopular knowledge, there were usually no empty seats. With 2,000 copies published in Vitebsk in 1922, the book quickly became a rarity. First, it was found in a private collection, and an examination for authenticity was conducted. Then the activists of the association launched a crowdfunding campaign and raised funds to buy it. Finally, The solemn transfer took place on February 23rd, 2020 in Minsk on Kazimir Malevich's birthday. Director of the Vitebsk Center of Modern Art, Andrei Dukovnikov, received the book in the presence of donors and gave them an informal lecture about Malevich and about this text. The next day, the book returned to its historical homeland and is now stored in the museum, which is to say, the Vitebsk Center of Modern Art. You could see here an image. This is a photograph taken during this solemn transfer on February 23rd, 2020. And you can see here, this is a photograph, high definition photograph of the cover of the book itself. And then here, I'm actually not certain what this is. Perhaps it's the back. Perhaps this is maybe the inside lining. But this is the third image which can be found on this Zviana webpage. And you can find this webpage in the show notes, by the way. So that's the first part of our introduction. But you might be wondering, okay, well, how exactly did we come into come into possession of this essay? Well, you might think perhaps it's easy to Google and just download online. Not so.
Mm.
As a matter of fact, this book, to my knowledge, can only be found in a greater collection of Malevich's writings called Essays on Art, Volume 1, 1915 to 1928. This book was translated by Xenia Klowacki Prus and Arnold Macmillan. It was published by Borgens Forlag in Copenhagen, Denmark in 1968. This book costs hundreds of dollars to purchase, and I have not been able to find it anywhere online as a PDF. But I am quite blessed to have contacts through social media who have a PDF of this book. And so they sent it to me. And now the three of us have had the absolute honor and pleasure of getting to read a rather rare and remarkable piece of literature from this incredible artist.
Mm.
So that's kind of my historical introduction to the piece. I would love to hear, before we start getting into specific ideas from the essay and specific reading excerpts and kind of drawing them into engagement with other literature, I'd just like to hear from each of you. What were some kind of general impressions that you got from this piece? I know that we've already spoken a little bit, but I'd like to hear more. Can we start with you, Hudson?
Yeah, certainly. General impressions about it.
Mm-hmm.
I found the introduction to be very, I found the introduction to be incredibly interesting, the way he sets the scene. And I feel like he puts together some building blocks that are really interesting. Because it does seem like he really starts with, he gets on to things like suprematism as new spirituality, rejection of imitation and art, art's role in the future. But the introduction I thought was really interesting, breaking down some basic things about stimulus, thought, reality, man, and the external. Yeah, I don't know. I got a lot out of the beginning is a general impression I have. Um, and yeah, I don't know. I'd
As
like
did
to hear
I.
what you guys have to say.
Yeah, pass it over to you, Ethan. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a very intriguing piece, and there are a number of key takeaways to this, but kind of to ducktail off of what Hudson said, I think it offers this almost alternative religion to
Um,
probably how or what um, maybe Malevich's heritage subscribed to. So I think that some of my main takeaways center around this idea of what is the purpose of man. And he talks a lot about the purpose and direction of man. And his diagnosis and assessment and articulation and exposition on the purpose of man is very thought-provoking and has led me to take some time to consider how would I articulate my perception and my belief about what the purpose of man is. And so that's really my takeaway is that was the focus to me. And that theme is woven throughout the essay. And it's a very thought-provoking theme. It truly makes you think and consider, or should at least, I believe.
Oh, agreed. I, hmm. I think the thing that floored me the most about the essay is just how, first of all, the man is just shockingly articulate. It's
Mm.
it's and we'll get into it. Of course, we are reading an English translation, but simply the fact that we're really reading a translation, that doesn't mean that the original language is, worse. I mean, the probability is that, when you translate one language to another, I think it's fair to say that certain ineffable qualities that come from a person speaking in their native tongue will probably be lost in
Mm,
translation. And that
absolutely.
doesn't mean that you shouldn't endeavor to translate. I think that translation is very important. But what I mean here is that if it's this good in English, I can only imagine how good it is in Russian. You know what
Mm.
I mean? Um, I was also shocked by just how wide-ranging it was. He speaks about an absolutely mind-blowing variety of matters, and in each case, he just handles it so delicately. He's such a poetic writer. I mean, it's obvious to me that, what I do wonder is it's so fascinating to encounter artists like this who they're known as artists. And then you read their writing and you're like, well, this guy's a philosopher. I mean, very
Mm.
much so. It's so anyway, kind of just throwing a bunch of stuff at the wall. But if either of you have an item that you'd like to begin with, kind of like a specific area that you'd like to address in the essay, feel free to jump in. I've got like a number of items that I'd like to get to as well, so we can kind of just go around the room and kind of explore. Looking forward to it.
Mm.
Can we, especially for, we've all had the wonderful opportunity to read this essay. Can we start from the beginning and kind of walk through Malevich's thoughts as he presented them? Because I think the way that he went about presenting them seems very intentional to me. So I would love to start with, number one, Malevich organizes this essay into points. There's what, 34 points in total, 32 points in total.
Hmm.
Um, and the way that he starts his conversation, the way that he starts his exposition is really assessing what is matter made of? What
Mm.
what is what is the substance of existence? And Gabe, I would love to hear your thought on how he, or maybe even Hudson, Hudson, what did you garner from um, how he articulates the substance of existence? And for reference, I'm particularly looking at point two. Just the first couple sentences, I think, really covers it.
Let me just pull up. I have it in front of me, so I might as well put point two in front of me. The Speaking of existence, I could not help, or in response to your question about existence, I could not help but see Lacan in all of this from what I've been reading lately about Lacan, about how the universe is somewhat unbounded. And I think in the way he talks about stimulus of the universe, there's this kind of no law stimulus, unbounded gray matter. I think you can think about it as, and then it is filtered into and interpreted by man, and man tries to make sense of the gray matter. And all I could do in that was see Lacan and the idea of like the social structures, the systems of ideology that man comes up with in order to interpret what feels very much like emptiness and gray matter. That was what I saw in it.
Yeah, let me read point two here, or at least the first sentence, if I may, Gabe, if that's okay.
Please. There's actually something from point two that I want to pull out as well. So you feel free to read as much of it as you like.
So I'll just start from the top, and I'll stop because I haven't pre-prepared this excerpt, but I'm just going to stop when I feel like it's appropriate. So point two starts with the groundless stimulus of the universe, like that of any other manifestation down to its smallest sections, has no law, and it is only when stimulus is split into the states of the real and the natural that the first law appears, i.e., or for example, rhythm, the first and most important law of all that is manifested in life. Gabe, your thoughts?
I love it. The thing that I particularly love is that this is the first thing that I marked down in my own note taking because I have an external source to pull in here, and I'd actually like to finish reading point two so that we can see what else he kind of derives from this idea of rhythm being the first and most important law of all that is manifested in life. Here's what he says after that. Without this law, nothing can move and be created. But I do not consider rhythm to be music, for music, like everything else, is based on this law. Music, like everything else, is limited, but rhythm is unlimited. The rhythm of a machine may be alien to music. Music is an attempt to link rhythms into a unity. An engineer links rhythm in a machine, but we do not consider the engineer a composer. In comparison, one must grasp the fact that music is not a law of rhythm, but something that is built on the rhythm of manifestation. I really like what he's doing here. And what I immediately remembered is a book which I have not yet mentioned on this program, but which I have mentioned to dear friend Ethan here, and probably Hudson as well, multiple times. It's a text called The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind
Mm.
by the psychologist Julian Jaynes. Now, I have a copy here, and I'd like to read a little bit from it. This book was published in 1976, and it was the culmination of Julian Jaynes's life's work. And the thing that I remembered that he speaks about is the fact that rhythm, chanting, drumming, percussive music is actually, it could even perhaps be viewed as the fundamental characteristic of human consciousness. So I'd like to just read a brief excerpt. This is from page 363. Let's see. Poetry was divine knowledge. And after the breakdown of the bicameral mind, poetry was the sound and tenor of authorization. Poetry commanded where prose could only ask. It felt good. In the wanderings of the Hebrews after the exodus from Egypt, it was the sacred shrine that was carried before the multitude, and followed by the people. But it was the poetry of Moses that determined where they would start and stop, and where they would go, where they would stay. The association of rhythmical or repetitively patterned utterance with supernatural knowledge endures well into the later conscious period. Among the early Arabic peoples, the word for poet was sha'ir, the knower, a person endowed with knowledge by the spirits. His metered speech in recitation was the mark of its divine origin. The poet and divine seer have a long tradition of association in the ancient world, and several Indo-European languages have a common term for them. Rhyme and alliteration, too, were always the linguistic province of the gods and their prophets. In at least some instances of spontaneous possession, the demonic utterances are in meter. So I'll just go ahead and put that excerpt to the side now. I don't know if Malevich was aware of the maybe even more fundamental properties of rhythm, because it seems that what he's saying here is that, well, okay, I think I kind of flipped that. What he's talking about is that rhythm is the first law of all that is manifested in life. And so what Jaynes has to contribute here is that he says, yes, it certainly is. And not only that, rhythm is also the first and most important law of human consciousness. So I'm just going to go ahead and let both of you speak on this matter, because to me, this is one of the most exciting things that I kind of encountered while reading this essay, is this parallel here.
You go ahead, Ethan, if you'd like to.
Yeah, for sure. You may be exactly right, because where Malevich takes this essay, you might be right in saying that Malevich may not understand how fundamental what he is saying actually has been observed by other individuals. So there's many who agree with this, who agree with him on that, or agree with him that rhythm is the most primal law by which existence operates by. Well, that is extremely meaningful. Why is that extremely meaningful? Because it's not only a reality observed from a spiritual sense, but it's also a reality that is observed on a physical sense as well. It reminds me of the Heisenberg's uncertainty principle in relationship to like measuring the states or momentum of atoms, right? You can either measure the state or the momentum of atom, why, or a particle, right? Why is that? Well, because particles are constantly abiding by this law of rhythm, this law of motion. And you can measure the speed or you can measure their state. You can measure at what state they exist in, but you can't do both. Well, very similarly, rhythm it's a very biblical concept as well. You have from Genesis, in the beginning, God said, let there be light, and there was light. It's from the very voice of God, from the very rhythm of God's intonation, that all creation exists. And I've recently been reading, I picked up the Westminster Confession or Westminster Confessions of Faith and Catechisms, which I've been reading kind of in tandem to some of our other readings. And one of the reasons I picked up this book is because I know that it's made a really big, large impact on our culture and our society. And I've never read it, and no one I've been around has talked about it at all. But I remember the first catechismic question, and that was, what is the chief end of man? And the reason that I'm presenting this right now and not later, because I think that this is most relevant later, but I want to reference it back to the stimulus, the rhythm. The question that the Westminster Confession of Faith and the Shorter Catechism answers, or the way that it answers this question, what is the chief end of man? It says, man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. That's very interesting. And I want to dive into that a lot more.
Yes.
But I think Malevich is hitting on a very profound reality about who God is and who man is in relationship to God. And that is that man is a product of the rhythm of God's voice, and that enjoyment of God is existing in tandem with that, in unity with that rhythm,
Synchronicity.
in
Mhm.
synchronicity. And the stimulus of rhythm, music, sight, sound, touch, all of these stimulus are a result of the motion and the state of particles. And so the stimulus and how they interact with human understanding and human stimulus. So the stimulus of rhythm, there cannot be enjoyment without stimulus, from my understanding. Maybe that'd be something to dive into. But I think Malevich is playing at some very fundamental principles when he breaks reality down to rhythm and stimulus. And I think that he's building a really strong foundation, even though he takes it in a very different direction than I would have expected when I was reading point 2. So that's my takeaway at this point. I know it's a lot, but I just want to build a foundation for the rest of the conversation about this. So, Hudson,
No,
what you got?
that's great. Hudson, please.
Can I quickly ask you guys what rhythm means to you? Because you're actually being a little bit more specific than I thought you were. I mean, I got to this rhythm part and it felt very abstract to me. And I was like, I don't really know what he means by there's a rhythm that is the basis for everything. And I wrote it down and I kept going, but I didn't see rhythm. I don't, what is rhythm to you guys? What does that mean? Gabe, heard you're
Mm,
expert, but what does that mean? Just something that repeats, a regular a thing, a pattern?
that's a great question. It's certainly harder to define than you would think it is when you use it colloquially. And
Yeah.
I do think that maybe a pattern is perhaps the closest synonym, but the difference is that rhythm, maybe you could call rhythm a real pattern, because a pattern is conceptual, right? When you think about a pattern, you're kind of constructing an idea of what a pattern might be in your mind. But a rhythm is something which is not necessarily even observed. It is, at least in the way that we're referring to it, right? Like perhaps there's a machine that operates in such a way that maybe there are some pistons, and the pistons are creating this kind of auditory rhythm. And obviously, if you want to be a solipsist about it, you could say, well, I mean, if nobody's observing it, then who's to say whether or not it really is going? And I don't,
Hold that point. Hold
we'll
that
hold
point.
that thought for sure.
Whatever.
Um, I think that that's kind of a baby's first philosophical question, if you will.
Sure. Yeah.
It's like it's like if you go to, yeah, if you walk into the philosophy store and you go straight to the K through 12 section, that's like the first one that you find. And some people get stuck there and they never move on.
Yeah.
But that's how I feel. That's how I see it. And I say that as a musician. I say that as someone who works with rhythm on really a daily basis in a very material sense. But I want to pass it, Ethan. What do you think? How do you see rhythm? Because you're speaking about it eloquently as well.
Hmm.
I wish I could grasp onto the correct word, the appropriate word, but rhythm to me very much exists in relationship to intelligible movement, real, as you said, real movement. But real is kind of like using the word in the explanation of the definition, because rhythm implies change and movement, and the reality that we exist in has a beginning. All of us come into being as we observe it, has beginning, initiation, which means change, which means movement. And so rhythm itself, even you said pattern, and so my definition of pattern may be a little deviant from what you're kind of expressing, because pattern means repetition, but I don't think rhythm necessitates repetition. You can have a rhythm that never repeats,
Hmm.
and so But for me, rhythm is intelligible movement, because if it was unintelligible, it could not exist. It would be non-existent movement, and non-existent movement would thereby be non-existent. It must be existent movement. And so to be existent movement, it must actually move in such a way that it is intelligible. It is capable of moving. And so this kind of plays into, you're talking about philosophy K through 12, this concept that the reality we live in only exists because it's the only possible existent reality. And that's not what I'm getting at. That's not what I'm playing at. But what I am playing at is that there is only like the movement of bodies that we exist in on a physical level. So trying to translate the metaphysical reality of this into a physical example. If the movement of bodies as we observe it, just the solar system, were to be altered, even a fraction of the way that it's intended to move, the existence that we would know would be completely impossible. And so that's what I mean by like intelligible movement. It must be possible. It must exist within the realm of possibility. And I think it is very metaphysical. I don't think it's very like the reality is that this metaphysical property has very concrete extrapolations. So even though it is very vague and very metaphysical and very generalizable,
Mm.
the fact that it can be translated to the concrete is proof of its truth. It's proof of its truth value because it can be relayed to the reality that we observe. Does that, I know that's a lot of a lot of jumbled words, but does that make sense,
Yeah,
Hudson?
that does make sense. I am curious if I don't know if a pattern is necessary to rhythm, but I do wonder if a certain kind of repetition is necessary for the definition of rhythm. Definitely movement, um, but I mean, I'm just looking at the definition right now, and it talks about a strong, regular, repeated pattern of movements or sound, which is a
Mm.
basic definition. But I I think it's very interesting. I mean, if you think about, Gabe, what you were talking about, the origin of consciousness, like chaos is quite literally when nothing repeats, when there's no sense of, I don't understand anything. I don't see a pattern. I cannot make sense of this.
Yes.
But if you think about going way back, yeah, consciousness does start when not only does something happen, but then it happens again, and you see the link from one thing to the next thing. Um,
Yes.
The sun rises again. And
yeah,
And there's that
exactly.
scripture reference that I think is especially useful here, right? This idea of God kind of hovering over the surface of the deep, or it's something to that
Mm,
effect. This
yeah.
idea of there having been a before time, a
mm,
time before creation, where there is a there is a nature, but there's no rupture in nature. There's nothing in
Uh,
nature that is like what man is today. Uh,
stillness.
there's no
right,
rhythm.
right.
There-
Which is it's kind of fascinating to imagine that somehow nature apart from man is chaos because there is no intelligibility to it. And yet it's also perfect, right? Because when
Mm,
God created the world, he created it perfectly. And but then again, I guess, if we're looking at the Genesis narrative, what about the before creation part? Like, was that perfect? I don't know, but that might be a little bit too abstract for us to get into at this current moment.
mm,
yeah, I think there's a lot to be said about that. But I
Hmm.
want to read part of the introduction to point four that
I
Malevich
wanted to
says.
I wanted to go to point four
Then
too.
please do. Please
Do you
do.
mind
Go
if I
ahead.
read? I want to give us point four and a little bit of point five, and I want to give a little bit of an intro before we launch into this. This is a very important part. All right, point four. This is on page 190 of the essay, or rather of the essays on art book. So, page 190. Man strives in his manifestations to achieve perfection through thought, i.e., to convey the reality of his stimulus. But at the moment of revealing form, he forgets that form is a condition and that in reality, form does not exist.
Mm.
How then can he reveal stimulus when stimulus is not a form and has no limits? Secondly, supposing that conditions were those of reality or the natural state, even at that moment, the stimulus itself conditionally passes into the interior of the form. The latter, as soon as it is revealed, dies away, for it has achieved in itself a certain perfection, or rather a step towards perfection. Thought has already passed on to stimulate another form, better able to reveal stimulus. Thus, we see life in forms as a degree of stimulus, but the community sees in life objective, practical, and lawful formations. Consequently, the essence of stimulus as non-objective is, in practical consciousness, considered objective. And I'll read a little bit of point 5 as well. Stimulus is a cosmic flame and lives on what is non-objective. Only in the skull of thought does it become cool in real concepts of its immeasurableness. And thought, as a certain degree in the action of stimulus, white hot from its flame, moves deeper and deeper into the infinite, creating in its path worlds of the universe. I must say, some some just really outstanding poetic prose here, but
Mhm.
I'm very interested in kind of drawing this out. What is it that he's getting at here? And this is where we can bring in Kant, Husserl, and phenomenology.
Mm.
So, in phenomenology, I suppose I should first give a brief introduction. What is phenomenology? So, phenomenology is kind of a subsidiary study within the German idealist tradition of philosophy that Kant could be said to be kind of the first phenomenologist. And what that means is that he draws this distinction between what he calls the phenomena and the noumena. The noumena is the real, it is the truth, it is the actual existence of the thing, of the world, and it is unobserved. And that's, but I don't want to get too ahead of myself. But the point is that the term noumena refers to this reality which is untainted by framing and by lens. And then the phenomena would be the experience that we as people have of the noumena, so to speak. The phenomenology is essentially a study of things which we experience. But what we don't say is that when a person experiences, for example, the wind in their hair and on their face, they are experiencing a phenomena. They are experiencing essentially a filtered version of the reality of that wind, whatever that reality might actually be. And so I wrote this, hopefully that's sufficient introduction to kind of get into just this brief little thing that I wrote here. So there's this concept called bracketing in phenomenology. So bracketing, which is also called Einklammerung or Epoche, two terms, one of them is German. Each of these refers to bracketing. It's a concept in phenomenology which refers to the suspension of one's judgment of a given experience in order to achieve an analysis of it. Edmund Husserl, who was born in 1859, formally developed this concept in accordance with Kant, who passed away in 1804. I bring those dates up just to say that Husserl was born just about 50 years after Kant passed away. So Husserl developed this beginning in his seminal 1913 book, General Introduction to a Pure Phenomenology, which is the first of 3 books in a series titled Ideas for a Pure Phenomenology and Phenomenological Philosophy. A bit of a mouthful, certainly, for the title of a series, But I bring all this up just to say that I think that Malevich here is constructing his own Kantian distinction between phenomena and noumena. He's speaking of stimulus as something which, and he actually speaks about this in kind of the very, very beginning of the essay. I'll bring up this one quote that I really quite like. The basis and society, sorry, the basis and reason for what in society we call life, I consider to be a stimulus which reveals itself in all possible forms, pure, unconscious, inexplicable. Its existence has never been proved. It is without number, precision, time, space, and absolute or relative condition. So point four, and I'll be brief here. Well, that's a hilarious thing for me to say. I'll try to wrap up my comment quickly.
I'll be verbose here.
I'll
your
continue
time.
my verbosity here. But I think that what he's doing is he's saying that stimulus is Kant's noumena. It is something which, as soon as you attempt to represent it, well, you've immediately tainted it by representing it. It is something which he holds to be real. There's no doubt that Malevich believes that something is real. He's not a nihilist. He believes that stimulus is real in an essential way, but he also believes that it is completely outside of the domain of human experience and understanding. I'll pause there. Do you guys think that I have a fair reading of these points?
Yes, when I mentioned earlier talking about Lacan, this was exactly where I was thinking of that. It's interesting that you go to Kant and phenomenology, because I went towards, I think I went naturally towards the psychoanalysis thing, because that's what I've been reading recently, I'm interested in. Um, but I say, yes, I like how you put it. When you try to represent the thing, it stops becoming the thing. My mind immediately went towards like you want a you have a desire to have a Coca-Cola drink, and as soon as you take the first drink, you no longer have the desire, and it is no longer as perfect as it once was. It's like, oh, this is the perfect Coca-Cola bottle, and it's cold, and it's got the little water droplets on it. I want it. And then as soon as you drink it, you're like, well, now I don't want it as much as I wanted it a second ago, now that I have it. Um, yeah. No, I do agree. Yeah, totally.
And
Perfect gift is the gift unopened.
Yeah.
remind me, there there is a what's the word for that? Lacan has a word that describes this kind of fundamental desire of desire.
Oh,
I just can't
wonder.
remember what it is. I
I
wish
don't know.
I haven't
No.
actually read I haven't read Lacan yet, but I was recently listening to a lecture about the four discourses, which I found very interesting. And perhaps maybe at some point in this podcast series we'll get into some Lacan and psychoanalysis material. I think that would be a fascinating world for us to start learning about. But anyway,
Yeah.
Ethan, what do you think?
I think he continues to build upon this concept in 6 and 7, and I think he kind of elucidates the point that he's driving at. That being said,
Ah, sorry, it's the objet petit a.
Mm,
Or
actually,
rather, that's the object of desire.
the object. Yeah.
Uh, anyway, I don't want to get too far down that rabbit hole. Continue, please, Ethan.
no. All I was saying is, I think that you guys are driving at or following in lockstep with what Malevich is saying, at least from my understanding, and that is he's describing the stimulus as not just the input, but also the direction of man. And we've had this discussion again referring back to this ultimately accessible sensuality, which revolves around stimulus. Um, but again, when I consider this, I can't help but think about the shorter catechism and that question, what is the chief purpose of man? And he ends up landing at a different conclusion, but he definitely builds upon his premise in point 6. He says in point 6, man is preparing to comprehend and learn everything.
Mm.
But is this everything before him? Can he put this everything on a table in front of him, investigate it, and describe it in books? Saying, here's a book where everything is described. Study it, and you will know everything. It seems to me that in order to investigate, study, and learn, I must be able to take out a unit that has no connection with its environment and is free from all influences and dependence. If I can do this, I shall comprehend it. If not, I shall comprehend nothing. Despite the mass of extracts and conclusions obtained, will the detective complete the investigation of a murder by finding the murderer and his motive of stealing valuables? Or must he investigate the murderer's psychology along with his nervous and other aspects, and condemn the state for failing in its system to foresee crimes and for being unable to distribute valuables, etc.? So what he drives at the beginning of that point is it's almost an indictment of much of the scientific exploits of his time. You know, science, the chief goal of science is to observe everything and diagnose and investigate and describe everything. That's the chief goal of science. And he's almost indicting science. I'd be curious to hear what you guys think of that interpretation of what he's saying here.
Hudson, feel free to jump.
You mean indicting science as in showing that even though science is about explaining everything, you can't understand everything?
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly very much a broader, it's not a critique, but it's almost opposed to, you know, he's an artist, right? He's coming from this perspective as an artist, you know, observing stimulus and trying to convey stimulus through his art,
Yeah.
which we had a discussion on our second episode very much about that topic. But you know, he's almost saying, hey, it's really folly to try and separate every particulate and use that
Yeah.
and try and look at that particulate under microscopic examination and then articulate every single aspect about what that particulate is outside of the relationship that it has to everything else. And this
Mhm.
drives home the point about rhythm, that rhythm is
Yeah.
movement. You know, movement must happen. Movement has all of its history and all of its momentum. It has all of its history and it has all of its direction. It's the vector of time, space, reality. And again, I think that he ties this in throughout this article, and that is, what is the purpose?
Mm.
What is this movement? What is this rhythm directionally heading towards? Which, of course, he hammers on in a very concrete way once he, you know, creates this diametrically, or this, I guess, disposition on the factory versus religion. But still the same, he discusses what is the purpose and then what are we trying to do to attain that purpose. Man is on this goal to diagnose everything. Man is on this goal to understand everything. He's trying to uncover the fabric of reality. That's it.
Mm.
That's what man is trying to do. He's trying to do. And later he
Yes.
talks about the means of how mankind attempts to discover this everything. But I
That's
don't want to just monologue here. What are your thoughts?
Go ahead, Gabe.
well, I was actually I don't want to stop you, Hudson, from engaging directly with that, but the way that I was going to engage with it is actually bring us forward a little bit in the essay
Mm-hmm.
and talk about science as a system, because I think that that's a very important part here.
Mm.
It's uh, Would you like me to just go ahead and speak on that, or Hudson, did you have any thoughts
Yeah.
that you wanted to go on?
You go ahead, and I'm sure my thought will come up again. If we're talking
Okay,
about, I was going to go towards science also, so let's do
perfect.
it.
Okay, so I'd actually like to, if I may, read some more of the essay and coordinate it back with this question because it very much does tie in. This is on pages 199 and 200, which, for those of you who are keeping track of the section numbers, this is sections 15. Yeah, this is in section 15. So we're jumping ahead a little bit. We can bounce around however much we need, but I think this is very important. Every system consists of units constructed in such a way that each one moving in its appointed place cannot go beyond the limit of the system. If one's unit goes beyond the system's limit, its destruction is inevitable, and there can be no system which does not bring its units within its limits. The system's perfection is marked by the fact that every unit having free movement and not experiencing pressure is nonetheless unable to leave the system's limits. I will call such a system generic. Generic couplings also create generic systems. For some reason, the system's original sin only befell the earthly paradise and not the entire universe. Even the earth itself escaped this sin, and therefore I perceive that the universe is without sin in its system. It, the generic system, knows neither prohibition nor limits, nor bounds, nor laws. There is no destruction in it, and nor can there be, since the disappearance or destruction of planets, what the community calls a catastrophe, does not exist within it. The generic couplings will retain their power and life of movement, and since they have none of the community's perfection, their various forms are eternally equal in their couplings, and their consciousness never disappears. Adam transgressed the forbidden limit, and this was enough for his entire line to be punished by banishment. Here began the history of its human suffering, sweat, calluses, bloodshed, the history of labor. This was God's terrible punishment for man. Paradise fell apart, and everything scattered and grew wild. Heavenly bliss disappeared, and all that Adam had had to do was to contemplate the eternal and beautiful movement, not even thinking, since God had already thought everything out.
Mm.
This is powerful stuff. And now, to provide just a little bit more material, I'm going to read some excerpts from Genesis chapters 2 and 3, because I think that what Malevich is doing, those of us who are familiar with the Genesis narrative of creation know that he is speaking in kind of an allegorical way about something which is quite literally depicted in Genesis. So let me go ahead and read this here. These are verses 8 and 9, 15 through 17 of chapter 2, and then verses 6 and 7 in chapter 3. I'm skipping some stuff for brevity, but this is going to be helpful. New King James Version. The Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. And out of the ground the Lord God made every tree grow that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. The tree of life was also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This is interesting. I didn't actually pinpoint this, and I don't really know the implications of it, but I feel like the tree of life is kind of not frequently discussed because we have
Mm.
the tree of life, and then we also have another tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And they don't appear to eat from the tree of life. And I don't really remember where the tree of life is ever again referred to in scripture. So maybe put a pin in
Revelation.
that. Ah, in Revelation. Very good.
Mm.
Here, we'll jump ahead a little bit. Then the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to tend and keep it. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, Of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall surely die. And then we'll jump a little bit more. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. She also gave to her husband with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves coverings. There is a lot here, and I actually skipped over the involvement of the serpent. The serpent is, of course, a very important character who had previously fallen from God's creative perfection and who influenced Eve, who then influenced Adam to follow in his footsteps, to essentially, for the first time in all of historical time, to actually act upon the free will that God had imbued into his created beings, his created human beings, Adam and Eve. This was the first time that either of them had ever said, I shall conceive of disobeying God.
Mm.
For all of the time prior to this, they had obeyed God. And keep in mind, we know from the New Testament in a variety of places that sin begins in the heart. Sin takes place first and foremost in the heart and in the mind,
Which
and
is to
not
say,
in what's up.
which is to say the soul or the will.
Exactly. Exactly. Thank you for that note. And that is to say that what we're really reading here in Genesis is that the moment that Eve doubted, I wonder if God is right. I wonder if I really shouldn't eat this. That's the moment of the first sin. Now, we see that the kind of consummation of the sin is what kind of creates the new fallen paradigm. But
Mm.
the thing that I posit here is that her moment of doubt, which is fascinatingly enough, it is a seed planted by the serpent.
Very interesting.
This is really the moment of sin, the moment that sin enters into God's perfect natural creation. Okay, how does this all coordinate? And again, apologies for the long lecture here, but it does come back, right? Because what we were just talking about before is science and this system, the system of units, and we're also talking about this concept of analysis of a particular, this analysis of a kind of an extracted object from its greater context. I think that there is some kind of link between science and the basis of science as kind of the pursuit of knowledge of the world. Surely this is inextricably linked with the fall, with the fall as the introduction of the knowledge of good and evil. Prior, or really, as we'll also see in Malevich, this is the introduction of thought.
Mm.
Thought, as you and I, as all three of us here and the rest of us in the world experience it today, I think that thought was formally different prior to this fall. And that
Yeah.
it might not even be properly characterized as thought in the way that we characterize it. So I'm just going to let that rest, and I want y'all to go ahead and engage here.
Yeah,
Feel free to jump in, Hudson.
totally. That's that's very interesting what you're saying. It's funny, the thought I was going to say a little bit ago to Ethan is now exactly what you're getting at. I was thinking, or my mind went quickly to science and trying to understand everything. Obviously, you look at one thing and you try to understand everything. Is, I think, a highly spiritual act and perhaps a divine act, what makes us human. Just like you said, great example of this is Stephen Hawking, right? The theory of everything. Stephen Hawking, pronounced atheist, scientist, whatever, um, Big Bang, stuff that seems very much in opposition to Christianity, the creation story. is obsessed with the theory of everything. He's obsessed with finding the rhythm, the pattern in the smallest thing to the biggest thing. He's like, it's all connected. I know it and I can find it. And he's crazy. If you look at his worldview and his ideology, the scientific community, they're like, homie, you cannot find something that's going to explain the smallest thing and the biggest thing. But I think it's because there's this spiritual, deistic likeness to God. It says that God made man after his own image. I think all of us are imbued with this desire to find the rhythm in the smallest thing to the biggest thing, even if you're doing it through a lens that is not. Anyway,
Hold on.
Yeah.
You cut out for just a second there. Say that last part again.
the last part,
Even if you're not doing it.
it it is imbued with worldview of your ideology. Please forgive me, my internet.
Let's just give him a second to catch up here.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So
What
You still
Hudson?
there?
what?
We're hearing you.
So I want
over.
to let's go ahead and I want to end on one last couple of quotes from some supporting literature, and then let's go ahead and head into an intermission and concluding our first hour. What do you think of that, Gabe?
Totally down.
So let me read. This is point 12 from God is Not Cast Down by Malevich. He said, man is also a cosmos or Hercules around which rotate suns and their systems. Similarly, there revolve around him in a whirlwind all the objects he has created. And like the sun, he guides them and draws them after him into the unknown path of the infinite, just as the universe with all its stimuli is, perhaps, striving for unity. So do all his pulverized objects comprise the unity of his center, which in its turn moves along the paths of universal passion. Thus, unity after unity, joining one another, strives towards the endless path of the non-objective, which I know that we skipped over a little bit of Malevich's definition of the non-objective, but what he means when he says non-objective, in my interpretation, is the supremely subjective. However, Malevich puts man as the center of this supremely subjective. Whereas I think individuals like Thomas Aquinas or Gabriel, I think the individual that you were kind of driving at was Leibniz. Leibniz puts God at the center of the supremely subjective, the one who is in perfect unity as unity itself, the one who, through his perception of reality, all things, all things surround and revolve around. And what's really interesting about like Thomas Aquinas is during his time there was debates about the heliocentric universe, whether everything revolved around the sun. And his point, he kind of drove at a much more metaphysical point, and that's that everything actually revolves around God. And I think that this is a quote from Leibniz's The Monadology. Point 41, he says, point 40, he says, we may also hold that this supreme substance, which is unique, universal, and necessary, nothing outside of it being independent of it. We talked about everything existing in relationship to everything else. So I'll continue. Nothing outside of it being independent of it. This substance, which is a pure substance of possible beings, must be illimitable, and must contain as much reality as is possible. Whence it follows that God is absolutely perfect. For perfection is nothing but amount of positive reality in the strict sense, leaving out of account the limits or bounds in things which are limited. And where there is no bounds, that is to say, in God, perfection is absolute infinity. And this is I think that this, in a very both contradictory, but also in a completely in a complete agreement with Malevich, Leibniz is saying that the ultimate reality is this unity. And driving back to the catechism, the shorter catechism, if the goal of man is to exist in perfect unity, to enjoy God forever, to experience the stimulus of the unity, to be and to worship God, and to recognize God as separate, right? The word that we give for God is holy, which by definition means different, set apart, not disunity, not the finite, but rather the infinite. And in reading this essay, I wrote a small kind of my estimation of the world we live in. And I would like to read that, Gabe, if you don't mind. So
Please
this is
do.
point 3 and 4 from an article that we'll be publishing on Margin for Thought called The Telead. Point 3, matter is finite and intended for non-existence. The question arises, why has man, the eternal, been so loosely tied to matter, the non-eternal? By what name do we call this ephemeral and transient state of man? And what is the base condition he exists in? We may call this reality the telead. Teleos for purpose and monad for unit. Thus we have found a name for this vain material reality that the eternal has been positioned in and purposed by God to be set free from. Mankind lives in the telead, though only for a short while. Then why has God allowed man to deviate, to create, to suffer? Deviation, creation, and suffering, as aforementioned, are destined for non-existent, though man who holds these things is destined for existence. Herein we discover the crux of the matter. If God is infinite and man is finite and eternal, there is only to affirm the intentions of God or reject the intentions of God. By this we converge points 1 and 4, and we find the beginning and the end. There is only for man to affirm the intentions of God or reject them. Man may believe that through the rejection of the intentions of God, he elevates his own intentions to the same authority as God, but by doing so, he not only questions the infinite, but propels himself towards non-existence. For the finite cannot exist without the infinite. Thus, there are only those who are adherents of God and spare themselves, or those who are adversaries of God and his purposes, and thereby doom themselves. For the infinite and eternal remains greater than the finite and eternal, as the telead is observed to be in a finite and non-eternal continuance. So what am I getting at? What I'm getting at is that when we seek the unity, we're seeking a supremely purposed objective of man. And like you're saying, Hudson, when we try to explore creation, one of the things that I find is, for me, I discover the creativity and the infinite creativity of God. But when we try and deviate from unity, Gabriel, as you said, just as Adam did, just as Eve did, they separate themselves from the unity. They deviate from the unity. And that we as a human species are seeking perfection. And for me, the only means of actually entering back into perfection, entering back into unity, is through the imitation and discipleship of Christ Jesus. So for me, that's my priors. But I think that this is kind of what Malevich is playing with here, is this goal towards the unity, the goal towards perfection, grasping man's eternal, or like his actually temporal grasp at unity. And I think in the second hour, we'll get exactly at how Malevich kind of describes the way man is intending to grasp at eternity. Gabriel, Hudson, do you have anything else to add before we take an intermission?
I just think that this is a perfect place to wrap up the free portion of this episode. I've got a lot of things to say in response to your wonderfully written little blurb there. I'm sure Hudson does too, but I just want to go ahead and make a quick plug here. This is the first episode that we are creating where the first half is available for free. And the second half will be available for a small subscription fee on Patreon, and we will have a link to that in the video description in the show notes. So please tune in. We've got a lot of other truly remarkable stuff to cover relating to this essay. And thank you all so much for joining us thus far. So if you're listening to the Patreon episode right now, then you'll just see it as it'll just carry right on through to the next portion. And if you're on the YouTube version, then it'll wrap up right here. So if that's the
And
case, I want to thank both of you guys for joining me, and we'll continue just in a brief moment here. So you were going to say something, Ethan?
I just wanted to say thank you so much, Hudson. You're our first guest. We appreciate your input so much and your expertise, and you've added a lot to this conversation. So we're extremely appreciative and blessed by you joining us today. So that's
Thank you
all I
very
had to
much.
say. Thanks, Gabe. Thanks, Hudson.
Thanks, guys.